Welcome to the 3A Athletics Workshop Podcast. Deep dives through the journey of youth sports, what parents experience, what coaches experience, and most importantly, what your kids experience. We'll also feature the latest information, tips, tools, and resources to help parents, coaches, and athletes navigate and improve the culture of youth sports. And now, the 3A Athletics Workshop Podcast.
Welcome everybody back to the 3A Athletics Workshop Podcast. We're here, episode number 4, Triggers. I'm joined by my partner and co-founder, Seth Taylor, and we're excited to dive into triggers and how they apply to the world of youth sports with parents, coaches, and with players. So starting, Seth, what is the definition of a trigger?
Yeah, so triggers are a pretty well-worn word in the world of psychology. When someone is triggered, it's what it actually refers to is, if we kind of refer back to the conscious and unconscious, it refers to when something on the conscious level ignites, essentially almost like a fuse. It actually connects to something that's repressed into the unconscious world. So when there's something, an event, a person, an experience happens, and it actually is connected to that, usually what accompanies it is a large spike in emotional experience. So we would associate it with something like road rage, or a referee makes a bad call and we lose our mind, that kind of thing.
So what happens when a person is unaware of their triggers?
Yeah, if we have no awareness of their unconscious, and we have no awareness that, typically if there's no awareness of the unconscious, there's not going to be an awareness of a trigger. We'll use things like, oh, he's just got a hot temper, or something like that, or that just sets that guy, or he's kind of high strung. We'll use these kind of phrases to refer to somebody when actually what we're talking about is that person's triggered and there's trauma triggering it. Most common example is when someone's nervous. It's like, you nervous for the game today, bud? Yeah, he's actually triggered. That's why we can tend to locate it in the stomach, and butterflies and knots in the stomach. That's actually energy in the stomach. That's typically trauma that's repressed in that magnetic field there. And so it's in that, and then the fact that you're going into the unknown and you don't know what's going to happen, there's an uncertainty there, and it triggers that trauma. So we've just normalized it and called it nervous.
Yep.
Right?
So for parents then, what would be an example of a trigger for them sitting in the stands watching their child play a sport?
Well, it is triggering to watch your child play sports, right? Because you are taking this thing that, one, the love that a parent has for a child is, as you know, is one of the most intense emotional experiences a human can have. So you have this really intense emotional connection, plus your own trauma comes into play, your unmet needs, and your ego is trying to deal with that because of the uncertainty of them going out there. So this thing I love the most goes out there, might fail, might succeed, and your ego wants to resolve them, thus resolving you. And so it's a very intense trigger just to watch your kids play sports. So I think that in youth sports, the sideline, a parent sideline, is typically a completely triggered space. So there's lots of trauma showing up. It's one of the reasons why we typically everybody kind of knows it's kind of a toxic space to be. And most people go home going, oh my gosh, that parent was crazy, and that parent. And the really triggered parent makes me feel a little better because I'm only kind of triggered, Yeah. But everybody's very, very triggered. And then of course the added elements of, now the coach is yelling at my kid and I don't have any control over that. Now that referee just made a bad call on my kid and I don't have any control over that. There's so much out of your control that typically, because the go-to to control triggers is control. Mm-hmm. When youth sports, you have almost no control at all.
Yeah, I think for parents to understand, it's easy to look at your child's performance on a sports field and think that's a reflection of my parenting,
right?
Or a reflection of the job that I've done,
Absolutely.
Right? And that's that affirmation that unconsciously parents are bringing into that experience, saying, well, if my kid goes out there and performs well on the field, that's a good reflection on me. I've done my job. Instead of reframing that, as we've talked about in the previous episodes, this is a play experience. There's no expectation. This is not a performance, and it's not a reflection on us as parents. It's a genuine experience that we're trying to create a safe space for those kids to go out there and play.
Right.
Shifting to coaches, what would be an obvious example of a coach who gets triggered, and why do you think we see coaches across all sports getting kicked out of games bumping umpires. I mean, we've all seen the viral videos that are floating around social media. What's behind that?
Yeah, abusing players and stuff. It's essentially, it's similar to what the parents are, experiencing, except for now, instead of me just watching my kid, I'm coaching a team. I got 18 kids, or I got 11 players on a field, and I can't control any of it. And I've invested my time and my energy and my heart and sometimes my identity and my trauma and all my stuff into this space, hoping for success. And I have almost no control. And that's what triggers most coaches. Before I started all my therapeutic work, 15-ish years ago, I was coaching soccer, and I was a good coach, but I would get so intensely triggered sometimes. And I'm gonna use one great example. Like, there was a game. It's a U14 girls soccer team, so 13-year-old girls, but it's premier. It's one of the higher levels in the state for that age group, and we are in a playoff game, and we outshot the team 29-1. We had 29 shots in the game. They had one shot. We lost 1-0, and the experience of watching the time tick down and watching what was taking place out there everything was so completely out of my control that it stretched that energy held deep in my unconscious, which was pretty intense trauma. I mean, a childhood of really surviving some pretty intense tragedy and some really intense abandonment, and all that really deep trauma inside me was triggered so intensely by that experience. I needed them to be successful so that I would feel those unmet needs would be okay. And it was being pulled from me to the point where I lost my mind completely. I mean, it was almost an out-of-body experience. The words that came out of my mouth, if I told you what they were, you'd probably leave the table right now. I mean, it was just, I still think back on that and go, how did I go there? Well, that's how trauma comes into play every day for how we function. I almost got violent, not towards the players, but some parents were screaming at me because I was screaming at the players, and I jumped over a fence and started to go after a parent, and people holding. All this happened. And to an old side note, this is how toxic youth sports is. I wasn't fired. I just got a little 5-second talking to from the coaching director. But no one ever came up to me and said, "Hey man, I think you need to get some help," either.
Yeah.
Which is kind of tough. You know what I mean?
And I think it's been normalized, right? If you look at the generations of sports, we all grew up watching, the Mariners here in Seattle and wherever you're at. I'm sure you can remember a coach like Lou Piniella, right? Who had this fiery attitude, who set the tone, had the discipline, the grit. And again, we're talking about professionals here, but that's the example, right? That we grew up watching, where a coach runs out on the base, throwing his stuff, picking up bases, chucking it. Yeah. I remember the video in the minor leagues probably 15 years ago. Coach was army crawling behind home. We throw, and I've been ejected from games. Yeah. I've been in fights on the field. Yeah. I've been triggered in that space and not been able to control my emotions. Yeah. I think you alluded to it before when we label people, right, as hot-headed, or we label people as an intense competitor.
We normalize,
That's been normalized, right? And that takes away from what's really going on beneath the surface, right? Which is something in the unconscious is getting triggered by that experience. And then the reaction, it doesn't equate to what actually happened, right? But because that's been normalized, we as parents think, oh, well, at some point I'm going to have to yell at my kids. Right. Now, there is a time and a place to assert, right, that position of leadership and trying to approach it more as a leader than as a dictator. Right. And I think as the culture has continued to shift over the last couple of decades, we're seeing more content around this space of how we can be gentle parents or we can be gentle coaches. And I think being able to give parents the understanding of that we all are working through these triggers on a daily basis, that our children, right, are going to be our greatest teachers and our greatest triggers in so many ways that forces us, right, if we're aware of this, to do the work.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. That's spot on.
And we have the guidebook Hero, right, which I think does a really good job of teaching parents how we can identify our own triggers as a sports parent. Yeah. For those of parents who are listening and haven't read the book, how would you encourage them to approach learning how to identify those triggers that they're experiencing when their child's playing sports?
Well, it starts with the paradigm shift. The fact that they're listening to this right now, every parent that's listening to this right now is already going, oh yeah, that thing triggers me. Right? They're already going, oh yeah, like the traffic, the people that get freaked out in traffic, the people that I get triggered by technology for some reason. If I hit a button and the thing doesn't happen like it's supposed to happen, but I have the ability to observe it, and so I can see my mind go into some crazy, like, what's going on here? And I can feel in my body anxieties tend to rise, and gain the ability to work with that. So the second a parent can let this information in, you can start to realize that triggers are a gift. They are a gift. If they're seen, identified, understood, and then we can work through the levels. Remember the 3 levels?
Yep.
If we can say, okay, so the trigger is that referee's out of his mind. The emotional experience is frustration typically. The body experience tends to come into the chest. You can feel this thing in here and this thing. And if we let ourselves get curious, like, okay, wait a minute. So it's starting here. And it's working its way out to this projection onto it's the referee, it's this thing. Even instead of being able to accept that sports has a certain out of control element that we have to be able to accept, just like traffic.
Yeah.
It's the same way. Yeah.
Well, I think to frame it for parents in a way where they understand the goal is to become the observer, right?
Yes.
And the observer is the person who is now aware of those triggers and can watch those separate from who they are, right? And I think it's been normalized that we are reactionary as a society instead of observing the reactions that we all are experiencing and then being able to reframe and work through the trauma that we've talked about that all of us are carrying in different ways.
Right.
Having that awareness is step one, which we go into, right? The watcher, the exercise in the book that's like, hey, we need to actually sit down and take note of this.
Yeah.
And then giving parents the understanding of those 3 levels and how you can work through that on your own, right? Because as we've talked about in previous episodes, we have to model the behavior first.
Right.
If we're not doing the work as parents, how can we expect a 7 or a 12 or a 15-year-old kid to go out there and do it differently than what we've shown them on a daily basis? And that's not just at sports, right? It's like you talked about, it could be the traffic. I know for me, specific to sports, being on time was a very big deal in my house. And being a professional athlete, if you were late, you get cut, right? Yeah. You're not on the bus, you're not on the team plane, we'll see you later, good luck finding a job. So it became very life or death for me, and diving back into some of my own traumatic experiences through childhood sports, realizing how intense the emotion and the energy became in the house, trying to get out the door, right? And I think for me as a parent, I've had to become aware of this, how intense I get, right? When you have a 7-year-old kid who doesn't quite know how to tie their shoes, and it's a 15 or 20-minute process to get 1 or 2 or 3 kids into the car and out the door. Yeah. One of the skills that I've been working on acquiring and continuing to repeat is give yourself more time, right? Become aware of what the problem is. The problem is I don't like being late, right? And there's a deeper component to that I have to continue to work through, but understanding that it's not your child's fault, that it's going to take them 15 or 20 minutes to get ready. We have to take ownership as the parents to say, okay, I know this triggers me badly, right? And then the reaction is I yell at my son, now we're driving to the field and there's this weird energy and he doesn't really know what dad's feeling, and now he knows if we're late it's a life or death experience, right? When it's really not, but that's that triggered response that I've experienced on several occasions that I've worked very hard over the last couple of years to reframe and understand A, what you're dealing with, right, a child, and B, what you're dealing with as an adult is little children, right, that we talked about in the unconscious that just stay there looking for that love that they didn't receive when they were kids.
Right, yeah. And I want to add to that real quick because the trigger thing, a lot of parents, even if they go, well, okay, so you got me down, I've got my stomach and I've got this thing in my chest, what do I do with that? And if it sounds like we are advocating therapy, we are. There's therapeutic work to be done for everyone. And part of the conversation that's been developing over the last 20 years, last 10 years really, is the conversation around the normalization of therapy rather than the normalization of anger and violence and all that kind of stuff. I've worked for soccer clubs. I coached soccer for 20 years. I worked for clubs where the normal culture was abusive. Like it was just like that was the way it is. I've listened to coaching directors walk in and go, now one thing about tryouts, nobody pick any effing fat kids, and yelled at, and that's like the normal culture. And you're like, I can't believe that I'm in this space. That was normal for so long. And now finally there's this conversation. What if we normalize the fact that we can all admit that we're pretty messed up and we've got to do this work. And so what we're talking about is working them down to that space now where Hero has a therapeutic element. It will teach you tools, how to work with that energy. And guess what? There's a whole world of therapeutic capabilities out there ready and waiting to teach us to be able to become better people.
Yeah, and I think one thing that sticks out for me is old school versus new school, right?
Yeah, that's a really good term.
And that's where I grew up with old school coaches.
Me too.
I identified as an old school when I came into professional baseball. Obviously made mistakes being 18, 19, 20 years old, but I gravitated towards that normalization that being triggered is okay. That yelling at somebody no matter who they are, is appropriate,
Yeah.
right? And as I've learned through my own therapeutic journey, it's not what you say, it's how you say it, right? And I think that's one of the things for parents listening that grew up, in our generation. We were raised by coaches and by parents who were emotionally unavailable,
Right.
or shut down or triggered on a consistent basis, right? And it creates that normalization to think, well, I turned out good in these ways, and I have discipline and I have grit to what extent, right? But being able to understand that old school was the way things were done, and that new school is the evolution, right, of taking things that we thought were working 15, 20, 30 years ago, and being able to reframe and look at those things and say, you know what, if we really want to make the impact on the child, right, or if you're in a leadership position in your company, I've had to learn this transitioning out of baseball into the world of business, you can't take the clubhouse approach of blowing somebody up and thinking that's the way it was done for 20 years before I got here, and that's the way it's got to continue. And I think that's what we're encouraging parents to do, is just because it was done one way doesn't mean that's the best way to do this moving forward for our children.
And for those that are afraid of the new school because they're afraid it's too woke or something like that, let's just give it a whole different level. What we're talking about is an elite school. We're talking about giving our kids what's necessary to turn them into the highest performers plus sustainably happy people. It's the right school,
At whatever level your kids participate in youth sports, you and your kids will benefit greatly from the resources 3A Athletics has carefully created to protect the foundation of your child's identity and your relationship. At the same time, these resources can help you unlock your child's true potential in sports and in life. The sooner you get started, the more successful your kid can be. Resources like Hero, an interactive guidebook taking parents of young athletes on a journey through their own experiences and perspectives, and how to approach the balance between being a loving parent and encouraging your child to push through challenges and excel in their endeavors. 3A Athletics. Awareness, activation, achievement. From good to great. See us at 3athletics.com.
So we're talking about triggers. The word trigger can be triggering for some parents.
Language.
Why do most human beings feel afraid or feel some type of way when the term trigger is brought up?
Yeah. I've had therapists get triggered by that word. There's triggers used too much. We just not use that. And I can tell they're actually avoiding something because they're triggered. You know what I mean? And they're trying to, we use it. Human beings use language in an interesting way. We use language to create barriers for us to not have to deal with what's sitting underneath those words. So there's all kinds of, at any given time, this is why we have the concepts of politically correct and stuff, is that we create language to protect us from certain things. We give things definitions, give yourself a better title. I'm the director of content because that feels good, right? As opposed to, he's a writer, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That kind of thing. We use language in this way, and the word trigger, when it gets used a lot, it's been used a lot, but it's a helpful thing. But what it does is it attaches itself to certain experiences, and people can kind of, if a person has a lot of stuff that's been triggered underneath the surface, and you go, man, you're triggered. I'm not triggered. You know how many times I've seen that? I'm not triggered. And they just this huge emotional outburst. It's happened to me just recently. I was working with someone. I said, this is clearly triggering you. And she yelled at me, I'm not triggered at all. And you go, whoa. Okay, and you're kind of sitting there going, and you can see it, that the word is this kind of barrier, you know what I mean? And people use this all the time. So they use words like we said earlier. They use the word woke, which is this kind of pop word that's out there now that refers to a certain type of consciousness, and there's people that will use that word. Even all it means is awake, right? That's all we're talking about. We're just awake, right? But we use that now, and I'm going to attach some meaning to that word that keeps me from having to go under and actually deal with what's underneath the surface. And so when we use that term, it's a tricky one because we are referring to, it's like an iceberg in the sense that there's part of it sticking up out of the water, and if we say that's the trigger, that's what's showing us underneath. And so it's necessary. Language is this kind of necessary evil, because ultimately what we're talking about is energy. When you see someone have road rage, there's an energy exuding from their body. There's this intensity, anger coming out of them, and all this kind of thing. Ultimately, that's what we're talking about. A trigger, ultimately it's a word, And that word is referring to something that kind of shows us what's underneath. But what's underneath is what matters.
Yeah.
But human beings use language to try to define things. And at times it's very, very problematic.
So how would you say Hero, the guidebook that we have for
Yeah.
parents, and everybody listening to this should pick up a copy now.
Absolutely.
Don't wait.
Yeah.
How do you think Hero empowers parents to embrace triggers and look at that as more of a map
Mhm.
to guide them on their own journey to become a healthier version of themselves, which ultimately leads to a healthier child?
Yeah. Well, it ultimately, because it's trying to create an awareness of the unconscious, because the Hero focuses our attention on the unconscious as opposed to on the word. Lots of people, lots of books, lots of processes out there focus people on the words, right? As opposed to, and that's what we see in politics and in the news, everybody's focused on the words, which is focus on the word woke, instead of focusing on what it's referring to or what's going on underneath the surface, right? And so Hero points people into that unconscious space, keeps their focus there, keeps their attention expanding there. And so then we can just use triggers, just a word that we use to try to talk about this in a proper way. But that's the idea, is it's creating and expanding a profound awareness of what's going on underneath the surface. And then it gives us an awareness like, okay, that triggers me, and I've been learning how to feel this, and I've been learning how to see this. And so when my kid gets in the car, when they're playing, yeah, it triggers me. I can feel it. Does that make sense?
Yep. And for parents to understand, creating the awareness is step one,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And I think what I love about this book is it then gives you some action items or some things that you can put into play with your own process.
Right.
But we also have a section for your child, right?
Yeah.
And we have a section for your coach, because the coaches are triggering, the players are triggering, and the parents are the ones that are trying to manage this experience and be that lighthouse that we've talked about that can just hold the space for our child.
Yeah.
Why do you think it's so important for parents to identify and work through those triggers?
Because that's where the damage is being done, right? The triggers are pointing to the thing that's doing damage. That unconscious is always speaking. It's always making itself known. It's always expressing its needs. And ultimately, it's dictating all reality unless we become aware of it. And that it gives us the capability of starting to consciously shape our world. If I'm aware of this thing is triggering me, I'm aware of the fact. I'm thinking of my son's soccer game just the other day. There was something what the coach on the other team was saying, and he was yelling a certain thing, and it started to trigger me a little bit. And I'm just aware of that. I could see this emotion rise up, and I saw this story going, dude, you should do this in my brain. And I'm going, And I'm just aware of all of that. So I'm able to consciously decide if that's going to come out my mouth or not. Is that going to shape my child's future?
And that's the observer that we're talking about, right? And
Yeah.
my story to piggyback that,
Yeah.
I'm a retired Major League Baseball player.
Mm.
I coach my son's Little League coach pitch team. I'm the coach that's out there pitching to the kids,
Yeah.
right? So we have parents, and we have great parents on this team.
Yeah.
But we were playing against another coach, and he came up to my son, who was in the batter's box, and started adjusting the way that he was standing in the box.
Mm.
My initial response to that trigger was, I'm going to tell this guy who I am, and I'm going to let him know that he doesn't try and coach my child, because I'm the professional on this field, right?
Yeah.
And that's something through our work together I've become so much more aware of, right? When we think we have the answer to the problem, we immediately want to defend our position
Right.
to be the person to assert that skill or moment, the teaching moment for our child.
Yeah.
The greatest takeaway for me was I didn't say anything. I observed the emotions. I listened to the ego narrative that's, I'm going to tell this guy, right?
Mhm.
And what ended up happening is I didn't say anything. He helped my son get into a better position. His intentions were great. And
Mm.
my son had a great at bat,
Yeah.
right? And in that moment, as a parent, I could have, right,
Right.
bought it, taken the bait and just let him have it.
Yeah.
But without the understanding of how is that going to project onto my son? How is that going to project to the parents in the stands? How is that going to project to the players standing behind me?
Yeah.
Right? And I think for us as parents and coaches to understand becoming that observer, which I think Hero does a great job of taking parents into that space to then learn how to be the observer and how to work through those moments without the reactionary desire or urge that we have based off the trigger we're experiencing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm also excited too, right? Because this is something within the Athlete's Journal
Hmm.
that kids are going to be able to start to go through this process, right? And our next episode, we talk about the relationship. The title's Your Parent, right? And it's all about the parent-child dynamic.
Yeah.
From the Athlete's Journal, it's the child's perspective. teaching them to become aware of the things that their parents say or do that trigger them, and allowing them an opportunity to start to put things down on paper and recognize what those triggers are and help them work through the 3 levels like we talked about, and have a better opportunity to speak their truth. Which I think, when you're triggered, right, the chances of you speaking your truth are very, very low. There's going to be an emotional reaction, but you're not actually saying what you're really experiencing and feeling. And I think for parents to draw that line between the unconscious and the conscious and understand that when we have those reactions, we're not actually speaking our truth, and we're doing more damage than we are good. And having the framework within Hero and the framework within the Athlete's Journal and Coach's Revolution too, right? Because coaches, as we talked about before, they get triggered, and that's like I was on the field. Giving coaches that same playbook, that same guidebook, to be able to go through that experience and understand what it is that's actually below the surface, that's getting triggered, that's causing me to yell at an umpire. It's causing me to have a confrontational interaction with a parent who maybe doesn't know the best way to approach a coach, right? And that's, again, why we have your coach section in the guidebook, Hero. So all parents, please don't wait. Get that book. Because it's an opportunity, right, to take ownership, raise awareness, take ownership, do the work, be the model, and have those intentional conversations with your child and or your coach in a safe space where we're not reacting the way human beings are designed to react from a triggered response, and just give it to them instead of saying, you know what is really the best way to formulate this conversation and have the greatest impact without making things worse.
No, Hero it's a missing link in the entire ecosphere, to use the whole ecosystem of youth sports. That's the word I'm looking for. The entire ecosystem of youth sports has needed something like this for a long time, and because we're all going, well, it's clearly toxic, and there's that healthy space over here, but we're so scared to enter into that kind of deeper space, that a resource like this that's easy to work through, it's accessible, it's executable, it's digestible. It is the missing link that's going to help us bridge that gap. And I think that every parent in America needs it.
Well, and I also think, too, there is that fear, right? Because it's a triggering experience. When you actually start to do the work, taking some steps backwards to take more steps forwards is what we're trying to encourage parents to approach this and embrace this with that courage of saying, I'm doing this for myself, right? Which we as parents need to take care of ourselves first. So that then I can provide my son or my daughter, my child, with a healthier experience because I'm taking ownership and working through my own stuff. So again, the fear of, I'm probably not doing that much. I know I'm not one of those crazy parents that's jumping over the fence and chasing people, but I still experience this stuff on a daily basis. Again, I think we're just continuing to try and reaffirm for parents to understand it can be a little bit scary. It can be a triggering experience. But again, the more that you learn to work through these things, embrace the hard stuff that we all want to teach our kids how to be gritty, right? But if we're not willing to be gritty ourselves and display that and go and put in the work and do the work that we know we need to do, that's where, again, the missing link here, as parents are so pivotal in that experience for their kids. And I'm looking forward to next episode, right? Because we're going to dive deeper into that dynamic of parent-child, how we teach kids to speak their truth, and how parents can create that safe space, right? So that their kid can come to them with sports issues, but this also applies off the field too.
Big time. Well, and it shows that there is no on the field without the off the field, right? This one's a tearjerker, so you have to.
At whatever level your kids participate in youth sports, you and your kids will benefit greatly from the resources 3A Athletics has carefully created to protect the foundation of your child's identity and your relationship. At the same time, these resources can help you unlock your child's true potential in sports and in life. The sooner you get started, the more successful your kid can be. Resources like Hero, an interactive guidebook taking parents of young athletes on a journey through their own experiences and perspectives, and how to approach the balance between being a loving parent and encouraging your child to push through challenges and excel in their endeavors. 3A Athletics. Awareness, activation, achievement. From good to great. See us at 3athletics.com.